All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is our lecture about state building in Africa, and this will be our last lecture of Unit 1. So we've already touched on all the other parts of the world, and we've already established the major themes that we're going to look at class during the rest of the school year. So this is going to be our last one here with Africa. We're going to see many of the major same themes going on, which is why I saved it for last, because we will see examples of decentralization and of centralization. We'll also see examples of how religion plays a role in a society. And then we'll end with a quick discussion on trade routes, which is going to be a nice segue into our next unit. We'll go ahead and get started then. Let's go ahead and look at the essential questions. The essential questions are the same as before. We're going to be looking at the factors that contribute to the formation, expansion, and decline of nations. And we're going to see that today with the Empire of Ghana and then the Mali Empire as well. How do they form? How do they expand? We're not really going to see the decline too much, but we can always make an assumption about the decline, mainly overspreading and overtaxation. Number two, what methods do governments use to centralize their power? We will see that. We've already seen that multiple times with the Conrad Demar's model. Now we're going to do that again within Africa instead of Europe or Asia or the Americas. And number three, how does the development of culture create long-term impacts? We'll see that, especially with the religious aspect to it, because we'll see that Islam is going to take a hold, especially in West Africa. By the end of our synchronous session, so not this one, our synchronous session, you should be able to complete an SAQ about state building in Africa during the time period 1200 to 1450. So we'll be working on our SAQ, and that will be a very good practice as we prepare for our test. Let's go ahead and look at, not at the AMSCO reading, but the quote of the day. Here is the quote of the day. It says, "For well over 1,000 years, the civilizations of Western Africa flourished. Most of us knew nothing about them. The history of the Dark Ages and the Renaissance in Europe is taught in every school. Most of Africa's history remains unknown to general readers." This is going to be a major theme that I'm going to talk about in class whenever we talk about Africa. It's not something that's ever going to appear on the test. They're never going to ask, why do people know about European history and not know as much about African history? It's just something that isn't really testable, but it's something that we should keep in mind, because a, a a society's importance is seen in history, in the things that we talk about. If we talk about Europe, that means we're placing importance on Europe. But the opposite or the inverse of that is true. If we don't talk about something, that must mean it's not important. And so often we have, at least in my experience as a history student, have ignored the history of Africa. Now, I will say that there have been many changes that have taken place since I've been in high school, that have put Africa at least a little bit more into the spotlight, and schools have started doing at least a better job at ensuring that we talk about African history. In fact, one of my favorite shirts that the Black Student Union has here at Rancho High School is, I might be quoting it wrong, is Black history didn't start with slavery. It's a map of Africa on the front. And I think that's such an important thing to keep in mind, is that often African history is entirely ignored, while European history is talked about over and over and over. Almost every single year, is you learn about some sort of European history. And what I want you to keep in mind is that when Europe is going through the Dark Ages, remember, we talked about Europe in feudalism. We said that, hey, there's not much technology or knowledge that's happening in Europe, in these small decentralized societies, and the only way that they get knowledge is because they trade. Well, that's the exact opposite of what's going on in Africa. We actually see that with we'll see with the Mali Empire, that they are flourishing. I mean, they are incredibly wealthy. They are incredibly intelligent as well, and far superior, and far more advanced than Europe, at least during that particular time period, during what we call the Dark Ages in Europe. There's at least a couple reasons why the history of Africa hasn't been studied as much. The first one is more of a Eurocentric view of history, especially when you look at the development of Western culture. We in the United States are in a Western society. most of our Western culture comes from European influences, comes from the Enlightenment that we'll talk about in Unit 5. And so we spend a lot of time looking at European history. And because we spend so much time on the Enlightenment, we often ignore African history, which many historians said, at least during the time that I was going to school, just wasn't as important or wasn't as pertinent because it didn't establish Western culture. The second thing is that much of African's history is told through its griots that we're going to be talking about on the next slide, which is verbal history instead of history that is written down or and recorded on paper or on stone or on something that we can actually see. And so this made it a bit more difficult for people to gather more information about African history. And because it was difficult, because it's difficult to obtain and it's difficult to teach, people just didn't teach it. And so I am at least going to do my best in order to teach African history and teach Africa's place in the world and give it an equal footing to all the other countries, and sorry, all the other continents that I cover. But just keep in mind that our education system has changed in its view of history over the last couple decades or so, and we should talk. We should be able to talk about that. We should be able to have discussions about what is important history and what isn't as an important history, or what should be taught in schools, or what maybe what can be glossed over and just kind of very briefly discussed in schools, because what we discuss within this classroom, what we discuss within this class tells us and informs us what the important things are. And sometimes those important things need to change in order to have a better society. I'll go ahead and get off my soapbox because I'm just going on way too long. Let's go ahead and get started here. We're talking about internal Africa, inland Africa. So we're talking about Africa not on the Atlantic Ocean or on the Indian Ocean, inland Africa. And it's important that you remember inland Africa and coastal Africa are entirely different. The way that those societies are set up are completely different from one another, and that will become incredibly obvious in just a second. In internal Africa, there's kin-based networks. Your families govern themselves instead of having a central ruler. So we've already talked about decentralized society. We saw the Mayans with their decentralized city states. We saw Europe during the Middle Ages before the Hundred Years' War they had decentralized societies. These kin-based networks are even more decentralized. It's the families really govern themselves and do their own thing. Now, if we were in class, we would have a big discussion about that. We would talk about what are the advantages of having a small society. What are the drawbacks of having a very small decentralized society? But I want you to know that within inland Africa, um, the government was very decentralized, very small as well. Because of the kin-based networks, because these small societies, they often fought against one another, and anyone who was a prisoner of war would be taken as a slave, and these slaves would be demanded in the Indian Ocean Exchange and eventually demanded in the Atlantic slave trade as well. And we'll talk about the Indian Ocean Exchange slave trade during Unit 2, and we'll talk about the Atlantic slave trade in Unit 4 as well. So I'm just kind of putting those out there right now and letting you know that we are going to talk about those things a little bit down the road. Let's go ahead and move on to our centralized societies. So now we're out of inland Africa and we're more on the coast. We're going to look at the west coast of Africa, and then for the last couple slides, we'll look at the east coast of Africa. We'll get over there a little bit later. Our first empire is the Empire of Ghana, which is going to rule from the 5th century and kind of falls apart by the 11th century. So it is outside of our study of history, but there's a couple things I at least wanted to talk about with it. One, this particular area right here, whether it's Ghana, whether it's Mali, whether it's the Songhai Empire, whether it's the Ashanti Empire, all those empires are going to roughly be in this area. This area has a whole lot of resources that can be used for trade. We said that trade produces wealth, and this is no different. The wealth of this particular area and whatever empire happens to be controlling that area comes from their trade. Now, what exactly are they trading? Gold, ivory, salt, copper, cloth, all of these things are being traded. Who are they trading with? Well, as we talked about with the Abbasid Caliphate, we briefly mentioned the Trans-Saharan trade. Here's the Sahara Desert right here. This is I mean, it used to be a massive body of that body of water until the monsoons shifted tens of thousands of years ago. We're not going to get into all of that. It's a massive desert now, and there's a lot of salt in it. And so Muslim traders would come here, grab salt, and bring it over to this particular area, whether it's Ghana or Mali or Songhai or whatever empire happens to be in control at that particular time, and would trade that for gold and then obviously bring gold back. And so, because of this connection between this area of West Africa and the Abbasid Caliphate, we're going to see that this area starts to believe in the Islamic faith, and we'll see that more and more on our next slide when we look at the Mali Empire. Ghana also used tribute from weaker societies. As they became centralized, they saw weaker, decentralized societies and would force them to pay tribute in order, and they would, quote unquote, protect them. That is Konrad Demar's model part number 3, and we've already seen examples of tribute payment with the Aztecs and with the Song Dynasty. So this is just another example of a society using tribute payments. We'll talk about Sundiata on this slide right here. So Ghana Empire falls apart. This leads to a bunch of small, decentralized societies. Well, these small, decentralized societies are step 1 of the Konrad Demar's model. They're small, they're decentralized, but they do have potential if only someone can organize them. Step in, Sundiata. Now, Sundiata, let's start with him as a young boy. As a young boy, he was crippled. He could not walk very well. He had a very limp leg. Just couldn't was not athletic. Was definitely not your stereotypical warrior. Now, his particular kin-based network, his society, was taken over by a larger and stronger society. And the warriors from that rival society came in and killed everyone. They killed his mother, they killed his father, but they left Sundiata. They said, look at this poor little crippled boy. He's going to die anyway. There's no sense in killing him. Sundiata grows up on his own, and he remembers the atrocities that were committed by this rival society, and he vows that he is going to get revenge on them. So as he grows older, he works his way out of his crippled condition, almost similar to like Forrest Gump, if you happen to have seen that movie. And so Sundiata eventually becomes a strong, powerful warrior, and he starts to unite the people together. He starts to give them a common purpose and a common enemy and a common religion, as he is going to convert to Islam. That's Konrad Demar's model, part number 2, by the way, get people to identify with the government. Sundiata eventually becomes so powerful that he takes over all of the other smaller societies around him, including that rival society that killed his mother and father. He establishes the Mali Empire in 1235, and that is going to be around until about 1400 or so. And we'll talk more about the fall and then the rise of the Songhai Empire in later units. So now we have the Mali Empire, which is right here. They have all of this gold, and they are willing to trade this gold for the salt that's coming from the Sahara. Who are they going to trade with? Well, the Muslim traders. This is an example of a continuity. And so we talked about change and continuity in our last lecture and how important looking at changes and looking at continuity is. And so this is an example of a continuity. This particular area always trades gold, ivory, and slaves for salt or for whatever they can get. Sometimes it's with the Muslims, in later units it will be with the Portuguese, but a big continuity is that their wealth comes from their trade. Now, Mansa Musa is Muslim, and he wants to advertise this particular area. I mean, after all, it's most people aren't coming down here. It's not like people are walking by Timbuktu and walking by the Mali Empire. So, he needs to advertise. Mansa Musa is a bit of a showman. He knows how to promote himself. He knows how to make himself and make his country known. And so, because he has the religious connection with this part of the world, after all, he's Muslim. They are Muslim right up here. He decides to go on a Hajj to Mecca. We said that that was a pilgrimage. That's a major part of the 5 pillars of Islam, is make a pilgrimage to Mecca. Of course, Mansa Musa is going to do this. Now, yeah, he does it for religious reasons because he's going to be a devout Muslim, but I mean, why not make a whole parade out of it? Why not make a show out of it? I mean, you wouldn't want to go to Mecca quietly, make everyone pay attention to you. And so Mansa Musa is going to bring this huge caravan with him. He's bringing hundreds of camels, thousands of slaves, and he's bringing more gold than anyone else has ever seen. I didn't mention this before, but it's important to mention now. Mansa Musa was the richest person in the history of the world. When we get to Unit 5, we'll talk about John D. Rockefeller. We'll talk about Andrew Carnegie. And we're talking about guys in the hundreds of billions of dollars who laugh at Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and say, get that chump change out of here. You guys are poor. I mean, that's how wealthy these guys are. And Mansa Musa is even more wealthy than they are. We're going to ballpark his net worth at about $400 billion, we'll say, which is far more than anyone else in the history of the world. It's because he has all of this access to gold and all of this access to the trade routes. And so he goes and he makes his way across the Sahara Desert and eventually gets to Cairo in Egypt. When he gets to Cairo, he needs to show off his wealth. He needs to let people know that Mansa Musa is here. He's got to be a little bit of a showman. And so he acts like Oprah. If you remember the Oprah show, which you guys are young, so you don't. If you remember the Oprah show, Oprah was always giving stuff away. She'd tell people like, "Hey, check on your seat," and you look on your seat, and like you've got a blender or something, and all the women would go nuts, like, "Oh, I got a blender!" Mansa Musa is doing that, but he's with gold. He's like, "You want some gold? Here's some gold. You want gold? Here's some gold." He's sitting on his camel. He's throwing gold at people. The people in Cairo are going nuts. They're like, never seen so much gold in their life. He throws out so much gold in Cairo to try to get people to like him that he actually bankrupts Cairo by causing hyperinflation due to the amount of gold that was now in circulation. So that's how wealthy he was. He didn't mean to actually bankrupt them, but he just accidentally did it because that's how much money he happened to have. He gets to Mecca. And when he gets to Mecca, he tells everyone, he's going to talk to everyone, he's going to say whatever he wants to say. He says, come down to Timbuktu. Come down to the Mali Empire right here. We have gold, we have salt, we have everything you need. We have knowledge, we have wealth. We are a great, wonderful, fantastic society. Come and visit us. And he gives directions as well. He says, look, all you got to do is go up through Cairo here. You got to go across the Sahara Desert, and then you got to go a little past Timbuktu. And once you get past there, you should hit Timbuktu. If you've hit Timbuktu, you've gone way too far. You got to turn around and you got to go back to Timbuktu because that's the place to be. And so Mansa Musa is using his showmanship and his wealth that he's gained via trade, gets more and more people to come to Timbuktu to engage in the salt for gold trade. This salt for gold trade makes everyone rich. And when we talk about trade in general in Unit 2, we're going to say when people trade, everyone wins, everyone becomes more wealthy. Why is salt so important? We know gold's important, we get that. Why is salt important? Well, this time period, there's no refrigeration. If you have meat, you have to cook it and eat it right away because you can't preserve meat. You can't just throw it in the freezer and say, well, I'll just wait a month or two and then I can cook it. The only way to preserve meat is to salt it. And so salt is worth its weight in gold. I mean, if you have salt or you have gold, you are an incredibly wealthy individual. Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire had both. I want to at least go on and say something that I maybe will make a little bit of sense right now, but I think will make more sense once we get to Unit 4. There is a historian who believes, and believes he has evidence, that the Mali Empire, right before Mansa Musa, was actually the first to send sailors to the New World and actually met up with the Aztecs who were already there. 99% of historians disagree. 99% of historians say that is not true, or there's at least not enough evidence for us to accurately say it is true. But I do want to bring this up here. When we get to Unit 4, we're going to see that wealth, knowledge, and centralization are necessary. You have to have them if you're ever going to get a boat across the Atlantic Ocean. We don't often associate wealth and knowledge and centralization with Africa. That's not me saying that. That's what many Americans believe. That's what, and Americans just do not associate those three words with African society. But I'm here to tell you that that is a false way of looking at Africa. While Europe is floundering around in the Middle Ages, having no idea what to do and having pretty much no technology until they finally decide to engage in the Crusades, the Mali Empire has wealth. They have the sulfur gold trade. They have knowledge. There's a big time university at Timbuktu. I mean, there are people, Muslim scholars, coming from the House of Wisdom in Baghdad just to go to the University of Timbuktu, and they have the centralization. So I'm not going to say that Mali did, in fact, send a sailor across the Atlantic Ocean who 100% landed in the New World and interacted with the Aztecs. I'm not going to say that. But I will say that it was possible. And that gives us an entirely different view, an entirely more accurate view on the history of Africa. Let's go ahead and move to the East Coast. So Mali Empire is over here. We are moving over to the East Coast down here, Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe grows for the same exact reasons that Mali grows. Great Zimbabwe is going to grow because it engages in trade. Instead of engaging in the trans-Saharan trade, they are going to engage in the Indian Ocean exchange. So you have people from India, people from China, this part of the world trading with the east coast of Africa, or what we call the Swahili coast. Here's what I want you to keep in mind. Here's something that you probably should have already realized. These two areas have a whole lot of knowledge and technology. So this area, because of trade, they are going to gain that knowledge and technology as well. So Great Zimbabwe is also going to be wealthy and also going to be intelligent and also going to be centralized because of all of the same reasons that Mali was highly centralized and highly intelligent and highly wealthy. Now, they're not trading salt for gold. Great Zimbabwe, this Swahili coast of Africa here, is trading gold and they're trading slaves. Slavery was a big part of the Indian Ocean exchange, and we'll talk about that more when we get to Unit 2. We also have an example of syncretism. We're going to get Bantu languages from India. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. We're going to get Bantu languages from Africa. I don't know why I messed up there. Bantu languages from Africa, Arabic languages from the Middle East. We'll even get some Indian languages from India. And all of those languages are going to be combined together to form the language of Swahili. We talked about Urdu earlier. When we looked at our study of Southeast Asia, it's the same thing. It is a synchronization of languages, and that language, even today, is spoken on this coast. That is why we call this the Swahili coast. We are going to return back to this particular area, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this in Unit 2. And our last part here is Ethiopia. Ethiopia, let me go back to the map, is right here. So I want you to keep this in mind. This is Eastern Africa, kind of north of Great Zimbabwe, north of the Swahili coast here. Ethiopia is a Christian kingdom. In fact, it is an island of Christianity surrounded by mainly Muslim religion. Remember, the Muslims are trading, and so Islam is going to spread. And Mansa Musa is more than willing to convert to Islam if it means that he gets to trade with the Muslims. So we see that this particular area up here is going to be mainly Islam. It's Ethiopia, which is more over here, that is going to be Christian. Now, they are Christian because they're former subjects of the Roman Empire. And hopefully, you talk about the Roman Empire in eighth grade and you remember some of that. But for the time being, all we need to know is Roman Empire was Christian, so Ethiopia is Christian. This is going to play a major role in Unit 6. In Unit 6, we'll see European imperialism, when Europeans are going to come in and start to extract resources from Africa using a very violent methods, as well as we'll talk about in Unit 6. Ethiopia is going to be the one country in Africa that avoids any sort of imperialism, with the exception of a few years because of Italy, but we'll talk about that later. And part of that reason, or part of Ethiopia's justification for not being imperialized, is they say, well, look, we're Christian just like the Europeans. So you shouldn't have Christian Europeans attack Christian Ethiopians. We all share the same exact religion. we'll see that that doesn't necessarily work out at that well for them, and Italy is going to completely ignore that. But once again, we'll talk about that in Unit 7. For right now, it's important to remember that Ethiopia is that island of Christianity in Africa. And that actually brings us to the end of our study of the developments in Africa. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at the Indian Ocean Exchange in Unit 2, and then we're obviously going to spend a lot of time talking about Africa in Unit 4 with the Atlantic slave trade, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about Africa in Unit 6 with European imperialism as well. That wraps up our study of Unit 1. Please make sure that you go back through the videos and look at them and really understand what's going on. Make sure you can compare societies with one another. Make sure you can see some of these changes and some of these continuities that happen over time. You might not be able to see those changes and continuities yet because our study of history has been so brief, but you should start to at least see some of them. Make sure you look at the methods of government as well. I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking about how do governments form their societies. We've spent a lot of time talking about the Conrad de Maris model. So you can pretty safely assume that it is incredibly important. Make sure you also look at the different aspects of culture. For each part of the world, you should know the major religion. You should know their major ideologies. You should know who they are trading with. You should know what technology they have, because all of these parts of their culture are going to have long term effects on their society. And I'm going to constantly call back to them throughout the year. So by the time we get to units 4, 5, 6, 7, you have to understand what went on in unit 1 in order to understand what's going on in those later units. So make sure you really do truly understand this unit. Our next lesson, our synchronous lesson, is going to be just looking at the Conrad de Maris model. So that's going to be a real good opportunity for us to summarize and go over, kind of review everything that we've gone over already as we prepare for the test.